Hello, everyone. Mr. Eford here. I hope that you guys are doing well today. We are going to be finishing up ancient Egypt with our video notes today. So we're bringing things to a close. We are going to be looking at the Egyptian Empire. We're going to specifically be focusing on the New Kingdom time period. Over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about the Old Kingdom and some of the significant events that happened there with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt with King Narmer. The first pharaohs and how they were viewed. We moved into the Middle Kingdom, and we talked about the golden age of Egypt as the empire grew and expanded, and we had that period of stability. And we're going to look at the New Kingdom today, and we're going to talk about the expansion of the empire, how Egypt grew, but we're also going to talk about how Egypt declined and how eventually that civilization lost its power and lost its precedence and its place in ancient civilization. We're going to work our way toward that today in class. Now, my students at home, you guys know the drill. You know that as we watch the video, you need to make sure that you're taking those notes, filling in the blanks. I will also link a copy of the Google slideshow in here that we're using for today's lesson. So go back and review that at your own pace if you need to. So with that being said, let's get started. We're going to jump into the New Kingdom time period. And we're going to do that right where we left off in the last set of notes that we did. And that is with Queen Hatshepsut. We talked about her, and we talked about how important she was as the first female ruler of ancient Egypt and why that was such a critical thing, that she comes in, she's an effective leader. She does a great job leading Egypt during that 20-plus year rule that she had. She develops Egypt's economy, trade expands. She goes all across the Mediterranean. They trade throughout Africa. Hatshepsut does some amazing things in Egypt. But at the end of her time period, she ends up dying. Her stepson, a guy by the name of Thutmose III, becomes the new pharaoh of Egypt. And where Hatshepsut has expanded Egypt's economy, Thutmose wants to expand Egypt's land and grow the empire. And that's exactly what we see him do when he takes the throne of Egypt. So as we look here, Thutmose's armies expand Egypt's borders to the north, all the way up to the Euphrates River. Now, if the Euphrates sounds familiar, it's because we've talked about it before. We looked at Mesopotamia. We talked about how the Euphrates River formed one of the boundaries of Mesopotamia. So Egypt's empire has expanded all the way to Mesopotamia at this point. Then he moves south into an area called Nubia, which is to the south of Egypt. So Egypt's land, their borders, is expanding under Thutmose's control. Okay? Now, with that being said, Thutmose's empire grew rich from a couple of things. One, trade. Okay, so just like Hatshepsut, he is continuing to trade throughout the known world at this point in time. And the other thing that brings wealth to Egypt is tribute. And we haven't really talked about this before, but tribute is basically if you are the conqueror, and in this case, Egypt is a conquering land that comes in and takes over another land, then the people of that land are expected to pay tribute. It's almost like paying a tax to the people who have conquered them. And so Egypt, because it has grown its empire, it's expanded, they are now collecting tribute. This is bringing a lot of money into the Egyptian empire from the people who they have conquered. So in addition to claiming gold and copper and ivory and other valuable goods from the conquered people, that's the tribute we talked about, Egyptians also enslaved many prisoners of war. Now you have to understand that up until this point, yes, slavery has existed in Egypt, but it has not been one of those components of society that we see a lot of. But under Thutmose and under the expansion of the Egyptian empire, we see the rise of slavery being something that is a big part of Egyptian culture at this point in time. Okay, the Egyptians enslaved prisoners of war. These unfortunate captives were put to work rebuilding the city of Thebes. Okay, they filled the city with beautiful palaces, temples, and monuments. So those slaves were being used for construction workers. Okay, they come in and they build and reconstruct some of these buildings in cities like Thebes in Egypt. All right, here we go. Slavery had not been widespread. This is what we talked about just a moment ago in Egypt up until this point. But during the New Kingdom, it became very common. Again, we see that as an unfortunate part of the New Kingdom time period is that this becomes really commonplace in Egypt. Enslaved people did have some rights, though, which is not something we're familiar with when we think about modern or our more modern view of slavery within the last, 300, 400 years. But enslaved people in Egypt did have some rights. They could own land. They could marry. They could eventually be granted their freedom. So these were all things that made slavery maybe a little bit different than our understanding of slavery from the more modern time period. All right, so legacies of two pharaohs. Around 1370 BC, a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep IV came to the throne. With the help of his wife Nefertiti, Amenhotep tried to lead Egypt in a new direction. And this is going to be something that we see a big shift in Egypt, and it wasn't much to the liking of most Egyptians at this point in time. Amenhotep realized that Egypt's priests were gaining power. Egypt is in some ways kind of like a theocracy at this point in time, which means that religious leaders like the priests have a lot of power and a lot of say-so in government. And they can kind of shape the policy of Egypt the way that they want to. Amenhotep realizes that, and he wants to shift the focus back to the pharaoh. He wants to be the one making the decisions and not the priests, okay? So in an attempt to maintain his own power, Amenhotep introduced a new religion in Egypt. Now remember, Egypt has been polytheistic up until this point. Many deities, many gods and goddesses. You've got Ra, the god of the sun. You've got Osiris, the god of the underworld. His wife Isis. You have Horus, who's the god of the pharaohs. Thoth is the god of wisdom. And the list goes on. There are hundreds of gods and goddesses in Egypt. Amenhotep tries to change that, okay? He wanted to sweep away the old gods and goddesses. He said, let's move away from those beliefs, those ideas that we had before, and we're going to worship one God. And the god that he wanted to have the Egyptians worship was Aton, which was the god of the sun. And he was a minor god. He wasn't like Ra, one of the big gods. Aton was one of the smaller gods. But Amenhotep focused the Egyptian religion on this particular deity. And he says, we're not going to worship any of the other gods. We're only going to worship this one. Okay? And this is basically an attempt to move Egypt from polytheism to monotheism. And the real reason behind this, Amenhotep wanted to take some of that power back from the priests and give it back to the pharaoh so that he had that authority to make laws and make changes the way that he saw fit. When Egypt's priests resisted these changes, and of course they would because it's taking power away from them, Amenhotep removed many of them from their positions. He seized their land, he closed their temples, and then he changed his name to the name Akhenaten, which means the spirit of Aten. So he actually says, look, I'm the spirit of this god that we are going to be worshiping, that Aten, the god of the sun. He began ruling Egypt from a new city, which was far away from Thebes. So he even moves the capital of the city during this time, or the capital of Egypt at this point in time. To most Egyptians, Akhenaten's attacks on the gods seemed to be an attack on Egypt itself. People had believed this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so for this pharaoh to come in and say, all right, guys, we're going to do away with the old things. We're doing something completely new here. A lot of people rebelled against that. And they said, we don't like this. We like the old way, the way that we did things before. So they refused to accept Aten as the only god. They continued to worship these other deities. Meanwhile, Akhenaten became so devoted to his new religion that he neglected his duties as king, okay, as pharaoh. His administration that he appointed, they weren't experienced like the priests were in the past. These were new guys coming in. They didn't know the ropes. They didn't know exactly what they had to do. And so they were ineffective in carrying out their duties. Okay? Akhenaten took no action when the Hittites, which were enemies from the north, from what is now Turkey, attacked Egypt. He pretty much ignored it. His country is under attack, and he doesn't even really give it that much attention. As a result, Egypt loses a lot of the land that they had possessed in Western Asia, or what we call Asia Minor. And this shrinks the size of the empire. So the empire has grown, but under Akhenaten, it shrinks a little bit. The Hittites come in and take some of that land as their own. All right, so we're moving from Akhenaten into a pharaoh that everyone is familiar with. And we're going to talk about this guy here in just a moment here. When Akhenaten died, his son-in-law inherited the throne. The new pharaoh, whose name was Tutankhamun, okay, was only, it says 10 years old in here. We think he may have been 9 years old when he actually became the pharaoh of Egypt. He relied on help from palace officials and priests because 9's really young. I mean, you think about someone who might be like in 4th grade ruling the country. That's a big responsibility. So he's got advisors. He's got help from the priest and from people who are above him to help him make wise decisions for Egypt. So those officials, those priests, they're helping him out. They convinced him, though, to restore the old religion. So where Akhenaten came in and said, we're going to worship Aten, we're going to become monotheistic, Tutankhamun says, no, we're going to do away with that. We're going to go back to our original ways, back to the ways we used to do things. So Egypt is polytheistic again at this point in time, where they worship Ra and Osiris and Horus and all these other gods and goddesses who they have worshipped up until this point. And Tutankhamun only rules for about 9 years, and he dies unexpectedly. We don't really know what caused Tut to die. We call him King Tut for short. There was some evidence at one point. People said maybe he was hit in the head with something. There was a thought that he might have been murdered. That's probably not the case after further examination. Some people have theorized that he died from an abscessed tooth, which means that he got an infection from a tooth being removed. Some people say that he died from malaria, other diseases. In the end, we really don't know. We can postulate, we can theorize, but we really don't know what killed King Tut. No one's really sure. What is certain, though, is that King Tut is that he really didn't do that much in Egypt besides restore the old ways, the old religion. But he is the most famous of all pharaohs. And the question is why, right? He didn't do that much in Egypt. He only ruled for 9 years. That's not really a long time to establish yourself or make a name through your policies. So what exactly made Tut such a famous pharaoh? Well, the answer to that question, the Boy King captured people's imaginations after a British archaeologist by the name of Howard Carter found his tomb in 1922 AD. Okay. And the discovery of a pharaoh's tomb was not that uncommon. We had found several of them up until this point, but Tut's tomb was unique. And we're going to talk about why it was unique here in this next slide. All right. The tomb contained the king's mummy. Again, we had seen mummies of pharaohs before. So again, not that big a deal at this point in time. Yes, a major archaeological discovery. I don't know what I just did there. Here we are. There's the slide. Sorry, I lost my place for a second there. I think my arm bumped the screen. Finding a pharaoh's body, again, it was a great archaeological discovery, but not unique. There have been several other pharaohs who have been discovered at this point in time. But what made Tut's discovery unique is that his tomb had been undisturbed, meaning that grave robbers and thieves had not discovered it yet. And so all of the treasure, all of the things that Tut had been buried with were still in the tomb with him. And that gave archaeologists this amazing view into the past where they could see how the pharaohs were buried, what kinds of things would have been buried with them. We discovered a trove of information about Egyptian death rituals when we discovered King Tut's tomb. So let's look at what we found. So the king's mummy, the incredible treasures, a brilliant gold face mask, which is probably the most iconic item from King Tut's tomb, made out of solid gold, painted in the likeness of the pharaoh's face, and it would have been put over his head after his body had been mummified and placed in the tomb. Okay. Carter's find was a thrilling discovery because most of the tombs in Egypt had already been discovered by grave robbers a long time before archaeologists could get there. And so we don't know what was buried there. It had already been stolen and taken away from the tomb. All right, so the end of the New Kingdom, and again, this is going to lead to sort of Egypt falling away from being such a powerful and important civilization in the world at this point in time. Around 1200 BC, the pharaohs worked to make Egypt great again. The most effective of these pharaohs was a guy by the name of Ramses II. He is one of, and again, we'll call him Ramses the Great from here on out because he did such amazing things in Egypt during his time as pharaoh. He reigned for 66 years. We think that Ramesses lived to be over 90 years old, which is old in today's terms. But if you consider back to ancient Egypt, if a person lived to be 45, they were old, right? Medicine wasn't what it is today. People did not live really long lives in ancient Egypt. You were lucky to make it to 50. 50 was old. Ramses lived to be over 90 years old. The people of Egypt thought that the country might collapse when Ramesses died because this guy had ruled for so long. So an incredible leader who led for a very, very long time. So his time of leadership, 1279 BC to 1213 BC. During this time, Egyptian armies regained some of that land in Western Asia that the Hittites had taken from them under Amenhotep's rule. Ramesses also launched ambitious building programs. Okay, he built temples and buildings all throughout Egypt, and he put his name on all of them, right? He did not want to be forgotten. He wanted people to know who he was. So all of these buildings were constructed under Ramesses. More buildings, more monuments were constructed under Ramesses II than any other pharaoh in all of Egypt. All right, under Ramses II and other New Kingdom rulers, scores of new temples. That just means a bunch, lots of them, okay, rose throughout Egypt. They were being built. Many were built by enslaved people who were captured during the war. We talked about that a little bit earlier as a New Kingdom practice that slavery was pretty commonplace, right? So slaves were being used to build these structures. The most magnificent was a temple called Karnak, built at Thebes. It's still there today. You can still go and see the temple at Karnak. Its huge columned hall, decorated with colorful paintings, still impresses visitors today. And that's one of the things that people go to Egypt to see. It's a major tourist attraction because of the history that's there. Unlike modern churches, though, the temples and mosques that exist today, Egyptian temples were not used for religious services. People didn't go there to worship their gods. They didn't go there to listen to a pastor or a preacher teach. They didn't go there to pray. Most Egyptians did all of that at home. They did their prayers at home. They considered the temples to be a living place, a house for their God to live in or their gods to live in. The priests and priestesses would carry out the duties, the rituals at the temple. They would wash the statues. They brought them food, brought them sacrifices. All of those things were done by the priests. The temples also served as banks. People would bring gold and valuable items, sweet-smelling oils, and they would place them in the temples as a holding spot. And they felt that those places were pretty well protected, so they could take their things that they valued to the temple and could leave them there. All right, after Ramesses II, though, this powerful leader, this important guy, Egypt's power began to fade. Later pharaohs had trouble keeping their neighboring countries under Egyptian control. A lot of rebellions happened. People wanted to take their land back. Groups from the Eastern Mediterranean attacked Egypt by sea. So the lower kingdom of Egypt, that northern part there by the Delta, came under constant attack from other people from the Mediterranean Sea. Right? Those soldiers used strong iron weapons, and the Egyptians had similar weapons. So it wasn't that they were outclassed that way, but the Egyptians had to pay more money for theirs because Egypt doesn't have access to iron ore. They've got plenty of gold along the Nile River, but they didn't have access to iron. So any of the weapons that they purchased, they had to purchase from neighboring countries, and it cost a lot of money to do that. By 1150 BC, the Egyptians had lost their empire, and they really only controlled the Nile Delta, that very northern part of Egypt, right up by the Mediterranean Sea. Beginning in the 900 BCs, Egypt came under the rule of outside groups, one after another. They were first conquered by the Libyans from the west. Then in about 750 BC, the people of Kush, which is another land to the south in Africa, came up and conquered Egypt. Finally, in 670 BC, Egypt was taken over by the Assyrians. And we've already talked about the Assyrians. They were a powerful warlike society from the north. They were from that Mesopotamian era. Okay. So Egypt kind of shifts control from all of these different areas, and they've lost their place in civilization at this point in time. They're not as powerful as they once were. And folks, that's it. We're going to talk about the final fall of Egypt, and we'll talk about Cleopatra and how Egypt kind of came to an end under the Greeks and the Romans face-to-face in class. So I will look forward to having that discussion with you. For my students at home, please make sure that you have filled in your notes and you've saved those to your Kami document so that you can go back and review them. There will also be a link to the slideshow in your Canvas as well so that you can go back and review that at your own pace. Hopefully you guys have learned a little something. Until we get to see each other face to face again, hope that you guys are doing well. Take care.